Today, I want to talk about a disturbing problem that many students and parents have emailed me about, or they messaged me, or they called me about it. And it has to do with the discrepancy between practice test scores and what you actually get on your real SAT or your real ACT, right? So let's say you spent 2 months studying with a tutor or studying on your own, taking a class, taking 15 practice tests. And let's just pretend, let's say you're talking about the old SAT. Let's say you score a 2100 average on your old SATs and you're feeling pretty confident going into test day. And then on test day, you take the test, you think things go well, you get your scores back, and then you get something like a 1750. So I get a lot of panicked calls and emails because this totally doesn't make any sense, right? It's pretty disturbing. Why, if I've done a bunch of practice tests, am I not getting at least reasonably close to the score that I expected to get? And again, this can apply to the old SAT, to the new SAT, to the ACT, really any test that you're taking, that you're practicing for. So what is the reason that, or the reasons that there's this 100 or 200 or even 300 point plus discrepancy in an SAT score between a practice test and a real test, or a 3, 4, 5, or 5 plus difference between the ACT score and the practice ACT score and the real ACT score? The first thing I want to say is that you're not alone. I get emails and questions about this all the time. It is so standard. It's something that happens to a lot of people. So it's not necessarily anything that you're doing particularly wrong, right? It's not something that's wrong with you and you alone. What we're going to talk about in this video are some of the reasons why this might happen. So let's run through some of the reasons why this could happen. Reason number one, variance. Variance is just the spread of your scores that happens due to chance, due to randomness, right? So on any given day, you could score, if you look at your score reports for, say, the SAT, you could score plus or minus 30 points on any given section. That's how they kind of report your scores. They report them as a range, even though, of course, you look at that score that you got, they actually give you a possible range of where your real, quote-unquote, score can sit. Now, if there are 3 sections, let's say on the old SAT, and they can vary by about 30 points, on the overall score, the overall composite score, you can bounce around within, I would say, a 100-point window, plus or minus, right, on any given test. And then same thing with the ACT, same thing with the new SAT. You're going to bounce around within a certain window just based on chance, based on randomness. Now, of course, if you got 400 points less on your actual test than you did on your on your practice tests, that's not due to chance. That's not due to randomness. But there is always going to be some variance. So that's why, as I'm going to stress later, it's really important to be able to take this test more than once, just so you can get a good sample of your testing variance, your testing range, and get some scores that are hopefully on the upper end of your natural variance range. So that's one reason. Again, not going to make a huge difference for those who are scoring quite different between their tests, but it is a factor. Second factor is a big one, test anxiety. So, maybe you've practiced and you feel comfortable when you're doing a practice test, but as soon as you get into the real environment, your mind goes blank, you get nervous, and you just freeze up and you don't answer questions, you have to skip questions, whatever it may be. You don't perform as well on the real thing than you do on the practice. And one of the ways this can manifest is for students who've done a lot of prep is they revert to bad habits. So you get into that environment where you're really anxious, and what you need to do, what you try to do, is find some comfort. And you do that by reverting to your bad habits that you've always done because they're more comfortable, right? So maybe you won't follow the strategy for attacking a section that you were taught. I mean, this happens, for example, one of the strategies I have for a lot of the tests is don't do the questions in order. You want to jump around and make sure you do them in easiest to hardest order, or most specific to most general, whatever it may be. But you don't generally want to do certain sections in order as they're presented. But once you get into that testing environment, you may get nervous and you may fall back on doing them in order just because that's comfortable. And that could lead to scores lower than what you would have expected on your practice tests. Another big reason is improper practice conditions. So when you're practicing your tests, you don't do it in quite the right way, and this leads to, therefore, natural discrepancies between the practice tests and the real thing. So what are some of these problems? So one of the big ones is not using proper materials, and by this I mean real practice tests from the test makers. If you're using a Kaplan book or Princeton Review book or McGraw-Hill book or Barron's book or some book by a tutor for your practice tests, and that's how you're getting your scores, those scores are just not reliable whatsoever. So you can't say, oh, my Princeton Review book said I was getting a 2100, and then on the real thing I got a 1600. That to me is not much of a surprise. I mean, I guess sort of it is, but still, there's at least some explanation there as, listen, you're not really comparing apples to apples. You're comparing a practice test from a company that doesn't write the SAT versus the real SAT written by the College Board. So you want to always use real practice tests, especially when you're doing full practice tests to get a score. If you're just trying to target specific areas for improvement, like let's say you wanted to work on exponents, then it's all right sometimes to use third-party materials just to target that kind of thing. But for real scores, real tests, you want to use actual materials from the College Board, from ACT. Not timed. Now, of course, if you're not doing the test under timed conditions, if you're giving yourself as much time as you want, it's not going to be realistic at all, because one of the big factors of these tests is the restrictions in time. So you want to make sure that you're timing yourself. Here's one that you may not think about, not bubbling in. So in the test day, you're going to be bubbling in to your little Scantron, right? And that takes time. I've made a video about this before. That takes a non-negligible amount of time, which then you're not going to have to actually work on problems. And if you, on your practice tests, are just circling answers on your page or on your test booklet, and you're not actually bubbling them in, this is much faster than bubbling in, and you're giving yourself more time. So when you're doing your practice test, you actually want to sit down with the multiple choice answer sheet with the pencil and bubble it in as if it was going to be graded by a Scantron, or as if it was going to be graded by the College Board. Of course, you will go ahead and look back at your bubble sheet and grade it, but you really want to make that as accurate, part of the accurate experience as possible. And then finally, this is a little bit strange, but your practice test might have been too casual. It kind of folds into that test anxiety thing I talked about. So if you're taking your practice tests in your room, you're taking maybe with music on, maybe not, but like you're in your comfortable room. Maybe you take a little bit too long of a break in between sections, right? Maybe you're not doing the full instructions, where there's quite a long process before you even take the test on test day, where you have to fill in your sheet with your name and stuff. They read all these instructions, right? You're not going through that process. If you're just treating it too casually, if it's too comfortable, you're not really emulating what it's like on test day. So you want to try to, as we'll talk about in the next video, ways to overcome these problems. You want to try to make your testing experience as close as possible to the real thing. But here's the other issue. I mean, we're going to talk about this with number 4. You will never be able to fully simulate what it's like to be taking the real test, because the real thing is real, and you know it, and you know that your practice tests aren't real. As much as you try to make them real, you know they're not. So that will never be simulated. That's a huge reason why there's often a part of the discrepancy comes from that the real test is the real thing, the pressure is real, the experience counts, and your practice test will never be able to simulate that, but at least we can try to make it as similar as possible. 4th reason, lack of experience with test day procedures, time and flow. So again, kind of like what I previously mentioned, there's that whole process in the beginning of filling in your name and your information. There's instructions the proctor has to read. The proctor goes through long instructions for each of the sections. There are a certain number of breaks interspersed throughout the SAT or ACT tests that you're taking. The flow of the day is perhaps a little bit different. So one of the major issues here then is simply not having that experience of being in the chair, right? Like we talked about previously, knowing the real thing counts, going through these procedures can make a difference. And as we'll talk about in the next video, one of the major things you can do to try to get closer to your practice test score is simply retake the test, because if you have that experience, you can use that experience of actually taking that test, and you will be more of a pro. You'll be more used to that experience, and you'll be more comfortable and ready to perform at your optimum and expected level. Improper scoring of practice or real tests. So on the one hand, you could just have not scored your test properly, which is, if you don't know how to score it, maybe you looked at the wrong table or you counted something wrong, you could be giving yourself an incorrect score. Much more rarely, there could be a problem with the scoring of the real test. Maybe the Scantron didn't read the bubbles for some reason, and maybe there was some other discrepancy. This is really, really rare. I wouldn't count on this if I were you, but it's possible, right? So if you're really suspicious that this is the case, you can usually order hand verification of the scoring, and that might lead to some differences. But more likely than that is improper scoring of practice tests. So make sure that you are scoring them properly. Okay, this one's a little bit weird, but in my experience, this might be more something that parents should know, I think. But because students who do this know they're doing it. But I've run into situations where students fudge, and by fudge, I mean stretch or not properly grade, shall we say, their tests, and maybe we can just come out and say that they're just cheating. So a lot of students who are under pressure, it's a little irrational, but I can understand it. A lot of students who are under pressure to get a certain score, whether pressure on themselves or pressure by their parents or by teachers or friends or their peer group, whatever it might be, there's a lot of pressure to get scores. So on practice tests, they want to tell their parents or their friends or even themselves that they scored a certain score. So when they score their own tests, they are a little too generous, shall we say. So this can come up in more innocent ways, so literally fudging. So sometimes students will say, oh, I got number 3 wrong. That's such an easy question. I wouldn't have got that wrong on the real test, so I'm going to count that as right. But of course, you can't do that. That's not how it works. If you got it wrong, you got it wrong. You can't assume you'll get it right on the real thing. As we've seen, you probably won't. That's the problem with these real tests. So it could be something as innocent as that, or just straight up cheating, right? So students will just not even do the test. I've seen this, right? They'll just go to the answer key. They'll just fill in the answers from the answer key and pretend to get a few wrong. They're not even doing the test then. Other times, they will grade the test and they will, they'll get, 10 wrong in a section, but then they'll erase their answers and get set 3 wrong instead of 10 wrong, so their score looks higher. It doesn't make sense on one level because you're doing nothing but harming yourself when you do that with practice tests. And it's not a surprise then that the real thing ends up being different because they're not comparing each other. But I also do, on one level, understand it because there's so much pressure and so much going on in students' lives that they feel like they need to do that. But if you're one who does this, or if you're a parent, maybe your student is doing this, don't be too hard on yourself. It's understandable, but to really get where you want to go, you have to not do that. And then finally, a massive systematic error. So this happens sometimes on real tests. So let's say on a real test, you skipped number 4 because you wanted to omit it or you wanted to go back to it later. But then when you answered the question for number 5, when you bubbled in your answer to number 5, you bubbled it into number 4 spot. And then number 6's question, you bubbled into number 5. And then number 7, you bubbled into number 6. And what you've done is you've messed up that entire section. So that's what I mean by massive systematic error. This is a kind of improper scoring on one level, right? You got the answers, you just put them in the wrong place. Unfortunately, I don't believe, well, it depends on the test. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. You got to check with the College Board or check with the test that you're looking at. A lot of times this is not something that can be hand verified, that can be fixed. So, if this happens to you, it's unfortunate. You'll just have to be more careful on the next test. So now that we've run through some of the reasons why there's some discrepancies, let's talk about how you can reach your true potential. What can you do to get closer to your practice test scores? What can you do to ensure that your practice tests are at least close to what your real test scores are going to be like? We're going to talk about that in the next video. To learn more about Reason Prep's SAT, SAT subject test, and ACT video courses, go to reasonprep.com/enroll, and you can find the link in the description below the video.